All right, so welcome. For those who I don't know, my name is Amy Fluharty, and I've been homeschooling for, I guess, about 17 years. I have two grown children, and so I have just one left. And so I have branched out about 4 years ago, I guess, and started a co-op because we really needed a Charlotte Mason resource and community. And so it has been a wonderful blessing for my family, and I hope for many others. So that's kind of how I spend most of my time, but I still am a Hive mentor. And so I still try to help out occasionally on that Hive when I can. Okay, so today what we're going to do, I'm going to walk through a little bit about my findings. So I love research. And so this basically has been me all through the years, letting my kids be the guinea pigs. And I have had some students this year volunteer to be guinea pigs. And so this last term. And so between my own research of studying and working out what has worked with my own students and my kids, I wanted to share what I found. I feel like in the Mason community, when we think about education and self-education, we kind of think of, here, you're old enough to read now. Here's your book, here's your lesson plan, and see you later. And that really is not helping our kids, setting them up for success. When they get into college or even in the life, just dealing in life, I think there's a lot of things that, we should consider to help them learn. And what I found is kids don't just pick up things by the way. Sometimes they do. I'm not going to say they don't, but these types of skills, I had to teach my kids. And I've noticed the past 4 years, the students that I have taught where the reading is done outside of class, they have not always prepared. And so I finally figured out why. So that's what I'm going to share with you guys today. All right. So we're going to talk about what is an independent learner, what is self-education, the steps that we can do to help prepare our kids, just kind of walking through some things to consider. And then I'm going to give you my final results of my students' feedback that I did this last term with them practicing these tips and things that we did in our class. Okay. So when we talk about an independent learner, I linked, and if you didn't get a chance to watch that, I recommend you do, because I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but I do have a distinction, and I kind of made up these terms. So it just works for me. But what is a independent learner and a semi-independent learner and a dependent learner, right? So an independent learner, I'm just going to tell you, is someone basically a student who is ready to be on their own. They're able to take the lesson plans and do everything independently without the aid of a teacher. Okay. And if you have time to watch that might be helpful, because I do see the importance of those steps of getting your kids ready from, being totally dependent on mom or a teacher and moving, in that direction. So there's definitely a process with that. So how do you know if my child is ready? Well, I can tell you that all kids don't fall in one particular grade, or just they are all different. Even my own kids fell into this at different times. Honestly, one of my kids it was probably their junior or senior year before I could start like handing it off, because he just needed more guidance. And that's totally fine. They might need more practice in those areas. And you as a mom should be able to figure out exactly where they are as you're teaching them through the years. So some things to consider, or are they responsible? Can they read a lesson plan? You need to teach them how to read a lesson plan. They have got to make sure that they have habits that are in place. Do they know how to learn? What are expectations? That is a huge thing I keep seeing. in my classes. They don't know what is expected and what should they be doing in this stage and where they are in their writing or in their development. You know, what are some things that can help them? And so on my website, I have started, because I did see that being a big issue, where kids really don't know when they're homeschooled what that looks like. So I do have, if you ever are curious or you just want to kind of see where your kids are, I do have student examples, and they're not necessarily the very best that those kids did. Some of their average, but they were kind of the best that they did. So it kind of varied, but that might give you a little bit of ballpark what to look for. Another thing to consider about knowing if your child is ready: are they disciplined? Are they diligent? Have they learned those habits? Attention is critical. They have got to have the habit of attention before you can just hand them off. And teaching that, sitting them aside and working all these things that Mason has talked about through the years should have just come through. So by the time, in my mind, it's by about 7th grade, you can start looking to see for these things. But not every 7th grader is right. One of my students, 7th grade, he was ready and he just took off after that. Then I had one that was like 11th grade. And I'm not quite sure about this one. We're hoping 8th grade is going to be it, but you never know. It's a slow process. So keep that in mind. Another thing you need to teach your kids is how to interact with a book. And that's actually what I'm going to focus on today. Coming up with a plan of execution, how to prepare for discussions with mom or a teacher. That's really key for kids to know how to do that. And just to remember that these skills, and the things that I'm teaching you guys today, we don't have to necessarily do them with every single subject. And I'm not saying that. But I think these are good skills that students should practice, especially if it's a hard subject or something that they struggle with. I think this will help them even more with that particular subject. So our goal is to help them know how to self-educate, because we want them to be lifelong learners. So some of the other things that, I want to consider is how to study the Bible by themselves, not with mom. Even though we love morning time, right? We want them to be with us forever and enjoy that time. But one day they will be gone, and they need to know how to study their Bible, how to have a quiet time. What does that even look like? How to pray. So things like that are things that we need to consider when we're teaching our kids and working through the years and developmentally things that, to help them. Okay, so I have a few quotes about self-education from Mason. She says that there is no education but self-education. That's so true. Because if a kid can be able to figure out and learn and do things on their own, they're going to remember it. They're going to make it their own. And that is just crucial. And that's what we want for them. We don't want to be, as a teacher, I'm not up there lecturing in my classes. I want them to be able to do the work themselves and guide them, right? So self-education is the only possible education. The rest, it's just mere veneer laid on the surface of a child's nature. Attention is not the only habit that follows due self-education. And then lastly, there is no education but self-education, and only as the young student works with his own mind, anything affected. And I'm sure you guys have seen that quote before, but it's really true. They have to make it their own for it to stick and to stay with them. Okay, so what steps can we do to help prepare them? So make sure in the early years that you teach those habits. And I've already mentioned the habit of attention, but another thing to really emphasize is best effort. One of the Bible verses I have post every week in the very beginning of my class is, I will do all things to my very best, right? To the Lord. We want our students to remember it's not about a grade, even though, yes, sometimes we need the grade or we need to a specific thing. We want them to do their best effort because God has called them to do their best, right? That's why we're here. But they need to be taught some of these things. They need direction. They need help. We want to teach them how to narrate. What does that even look like? And there's many different ways a kid could go about that. We need to teach them how. I have been very surprised, even in a Mason co-op, I have had kids come to me who've never done recap and narration. And so I just want to make sure everybody understands those steps. They are crucial. Recap is crucial. It's kind of like studying, and it's not easy for kids to do. And if you've tried it, it's difficult. It requires a lot of effort because you have to think, oh, now what did I remember last time? And so a kid will normally balk at that a bit, and they'll try to not do it, but just be patient and make them do it. And then they'll get in the habit and know of the importance of it. Okay, and then walk through the steps with your student until they're ready to do it on their own. You know, you might have to do one step then, another step later, and kind of work through the process and not just give them all at one time. So you know your student, so I would just make sure they understand their expectations and how to go through these ideas. Okay, before I move into my next thought, does anybody have any questions on any of that? All right, I didn't want people to have like tons of questions as I move through. Okay, good. All right. Okay, so what I do and what I did this year is before I get a kid a lesson plan or a syllabus or whatever, I would just have them look at the book. And I would consider, what kind of book is this? What's the genre? When was it written? What time period is the text written? And so sometimes it can be tricky because we want to kind of know the historical time period if it's a historical fiction, but we also want to kind of know when the author wrote the book too, because it's going to give you a lot of context and it's going to help the student, because we want the student to understand an author is basically going to pour out their heart and soul. Even if, I don't care what kind of book it is, their ideas and their beliefs on things are going to come through. And you kind of want to know what you're dealing with here. So I always have my students think what type of book it is, the time period it's written in, get a little feel for the author, and then I'll have them scan the book. And so that would be like looking at the title. What is this book about? You know, looking through it, looking at the table of contents, the preface, you know, all the different parts to the book. It makes me laugh because a lot of times kids don't realize there's a glossary in the back of some textbooks that are going to be very helpful. So they don't have to look up all those book words like in a dictionary or something. Some books are really nicely laid out that is going to be very easy. It's kind of like broken out really nicely to be able to narrate. So look for headings. Try to figure out what the purpose is of the book and what your child's goals are for the book. What type of idea are we looking for? Are we just trying to get big ideas? What is the author trying to get across? And what are our goals? Because your goal might be different from each particular book. So some of those types of things we would do before we even crack open and start reading a lesson. All right. So nonfiction text, there are lots of things to teach your child. Some authors use organizational words like first, second, third. I teach my students sometimes to underline or number those to help keep track of the flow of a text. You'll see that a lot in essays. When they get into high school, they'll be reading a lot of those. So, and also to kind of look for connected words or repeated words to help them to get the main idea. So keeping that idea when they're working through some types of nonfiction books. Some types, science textbooks sometime would be good. Sometimes it's recommended to like underline or put numbers. One thing I noticed too, like, what was one of the books we read this year? Escape for Saigon. Great book. And it was wonderful because the breakouts were pretty good about like a good place to stop in narrations. Most books are not like that, but that one was a great one to start this idea with. Okay, so I wanted to show you one example of what I meant with an essay. So this is a essay by FDR. It was a speech he did by FDR. We did this a couple years ago. I think actually we might have done it this year. But I circled what I was talking about. So for a student, when they're trying to pull out ideas and they're trying to outline an essay, which they will be doing in high school, kind of just showing them how to go about that could be helpful. So I just want to demonstrate that. Another thing that I will get the students to do is try to think about the main idea of a passage. So one of my examples that we worked on this year was a Bible one. And I gave you guys an easy one. So would anyone like to volunteer? So easy. Y'all can't get this wrong. And tell me one of the words that is repeated in this passage. Anybody want to volunteer? You could shout it out.
Though
I
I.
could put it in chat. Good, Charity.
Charity.
Yes, good. Charity, you are right. Very good. So, or my translation is charity, but I'm sure y'all might know it as love, and that's fine. But yes, that would be one thing we could try to get our kids to practice the idea of getting that repeated idea. Okay. All right. I'm not going to make you guys sit here and try to find the thesis. We might be here a while, but what we could do is when you give a student a reading, I actually had my students this year do this, but I had them work through it and I had asked them to try to find the thesis. And of course, we know the thesis is usually going to be in the first or second paragraph. And, and they had to think about like, what is the whole essay about? And can I figure out exactly which sentence demonstrates what his point is? So that's another thing that I really recommend teaching your kids how to find theses and a lot of essay type writings that they'll do in high school. Okay, so nonfiction texts, here are some other things I think we've kind of talked about. The only other thing I would recommend is determining what the author is trying to say, main ideas. So what is the author's views? And now we need to consider, is it a fact or is it fiction in this book? And we don't want our students to constantly just try to get a whole bunch of facts to know. We want to understand the big ideas. So that's another thing that can be tricky for kids is they're learning this process. So those are just some things to consider. In fiction books, something that I would recommend is determining what is a fact and what is fiction in the text. Because sometimes they'll read something and of course they think all books are, everything's true, right? And they're gonna have to learn to discern as they get in high school whether they agree or disagree with the author, or is it true or is it not true? These are great questions that you can have conversations with your students, especially if you pre-read, to think about and have those, ideas to talk about with them. And then think really deeply about the characters. One thing I often tell my students to think about, how are they acting? How are they feeling? How are they thinking? How are they changing in the book? A lot of times I'll have them highlight main characters and words that help characterize like that specific character as we've read. Ivanhoe we read this past year, and it was a wonderful example to use because he is extremely descriptive. He goes through a whole page just describing one person. So this is an example that we did this past year, where we were underlining and circling. I mean, this was a description of Rowena, and the whole thing was about how she was exquisitely fair. She had blue eyes. She was a Saxon lady, brown and flaxen. She had braided vagina. I mean, this whole page was just a description of her. So it can get very overwhelming. So sometimes underlining, circling things as you're working through a character can kind of help kids kind of get a big picture. And I'll talk about interacting with the text here later, but some things to consider. Okay, so how do we read a lesson and how to execute? So when they take the lesson plan and make it their own, I highly recommend in high school, if you can, to let students start making their own schedule. And I recommend making one. I said if needed, but some teachers will already go ahead and do that. But if it's not a class you're taking, or if you're a mom and you're trying to get them to work towards making a schedule, I recommend doing that. So that is the first thing, make a schedule. All right, now before reading a lesson, I always tell them to scan the chapter, and that is not reading. That's not even skimming. It's very much just a quick look through, trying to figure out where am I going to stop. This is a critical thing I found because students seem to think, oh, here's my lesson plan. Okay, I've got to read one chapter. Now I'm going to go read one chapter. No. No. Most kids cannot read a chapter and then move on. Fiction, possibly. Possibly, depending on the book. Not Ivanhoe, but maybe some, sure. But what I have found, especially nonfiction books or books that are very meaty, which have a lot of information, like Plutarch. There are times we read one paragraph and that is it, because it's jam-packed with information, okay? So a student really needs to know and learn, where am I going to stop and how much can I hold? This will be a learning process. They can scan the chapter and try to figure out, okay, I think approximately, but until they get comfortable with the book, it might take some time and adjusting, and that's totally fine. I also had them look for any words, like very quick ones that they think they might struggle with or might need. I know this is a debated topic, but I have found that if a kid constantly, and I would encourage this, they will see as they're reading usually words that are repeated over and over and over again. Those are the ones I think, if they don't know them, those are the ones they need to focus on. I'm not saying look at every single word. I just think it's a very good habit for them to pick a couple and define. It's one thing in the Mason community we just don't do. And how are they ever going to grow a vocabulary? Because a lot of times they'll read it, skip it, and sometimes they'll get it, and sometimes they don't. That is just my personal opinion. It is not a Mason thing, so you can take it or leave it. That one. But I just think I've seen that. I think it helps them when they come across, if they see it over and over again, if they have that written down. Or I've even told them, I say write it in a book, because when they go to read it, they don't have to go to another piece. It's a continuous reading and they don't have to interrupt their reading. And that's why I like to do that. And a lot of these things you might not have to do until they get into high school. So this is more high school things. Taking note of italics, writings, or dates. Some of my students like to circle them, some put in stickies, some like to keep a notepad by as they're reading and jot down. Totally doesn't matter. But it's just a great tool to be able to do that when they come to their book of centuries. Whenever they do it, they're right there and it's not hard to put them in. All right. All right. And then determining how you're going to interact with the text. That would be the next step. And I am going to talk quite a bit about that here in a minute. But I just want to reiterate the importance of recapping and narration in every lesson. I even told my students, it's kind of like quizzing yourself before every lesson. It's kind of like, what do I remember? And whatever I don't, I'm like, okay, if you can't remember that much, take a little tiny peek and see if that gets you started, because that mental process, otherwise they're not going to remember. Like they won't, it'll be gone like forever. So I highly recommend making sure your students do that. Okay, so when I mention interacting a text, this is what I mean. Marking important words as they're reading, underlining as you go, making question marks, or just kind of marking up your book, circling important ideas. If you can't write in a book, I have one student who can't, so she was always putting stickies. She must have had so many stickies. But that seemed to work really well for her. And you can do color code, whatever works for your student. I recommend them trying different things. And I had my students this past term try many different things to see what worked for them. And I'll give you the results at the end of kind of what worked best for them. It was surprising. All right. Making sure narrating after stops. Okay. So there is a little bit of confusion with this. Yes, Terry. I see a hand. Go.
Before you get too far, 2 slides back, you were talking about high schoolers were you mean like a reading schedule? Like could you define that a little bit more? Because obviously there's
Yeah.
lesson plans that the teacher had. What do you mean by the student making a plan?
Yeah. So I guess it depends on like the class. If she's using the Alvieri lesson plan, or just if a teacher has a syllabus, that's totally fine. But my idea of like a schedule is, when am I going to do this? How much
Okay. So
time am I going to need?
more like their weekly schedule. Like you have this week, these are all the things that need to be done. And then they kind of decide, okay, I like to do this at 9. I'm going to
Yeah.
do this after math. Okay. That makes more sense to
And
me.
I think it's good for them to be able to make those decisions, because they're going to own it, right? So that's why I recommend them. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So narrating after stops. Okay. In the Mason world, I think this is there's just a lot of different opinions on this, and I'm just going to tell you what's worked for us. And this truly is going to depend on the student. And so even the students that did this with me this term varied. Okay. What I mean by this is, remember how they broke up their sections of their reading of the assignment for the day. Some students might want to read that one section and write right after that one section. Some students might want to read that one section and narrate to the wall, and then keep going, and then narrate at the end. There are so many variations to this. And what we did in our class is I had kids try many different things. Each week they tried a different thing until they could figure out what was going to work for them. They are all very different. Some of them are very visual. I have to write it down. I'm like that. Sometimes I have to write down my thoughts as I'm going through it. And then at the end, that's when I want to discuss it. So some people, it's just the kids are going to have to figure out what works for them, and it's going to be a process. So some ideas that they can do after their stops is orally narrate to themselves or somebody else, which I don't recommend if you have lots of stops. Just narrate to the wall as they get older. Write down summary. They could just do a quick summary. They could do bullet points, a list of ideas. They can draw science, diagrams, sketches, pictures. It's going to be big in science. Charts. I will tell you a bunch of charts here in a minute. I'll show you some examples. It's totally up to the student, what's going to work for them. I would just try different things, different variations, but just make sure at the very end of the lesson they do something that's written and that will work for them. Because and it doesn't have to be elaborate. It's just something to help them make sure they have it. Now, sometimes in fiction, some students are like, I've got this. I'm going to go. If as long as they're narrating really well to somebody and can have a discussion, that's fine. In my classes, because there's something about being in class with other kids. They don't necessarily need to have all the writing aspect because they're discussing it in class with other people as we go along. So that writing piece is good for some kids where they have that time and they can jot. Some kids don't need that. So it's going to totally depend on your student. So just be sensitive to that. Okay, so how will I finish my final narration after I finished all my reading? They need to figure out, do I need a chart? Do I need to draw a diagram? How am I going to explain these ideas that I learned? Many ways. And I know there are books out, and I meant to grab that one, I forgot, that talk about different types of tools that you can use. And I'll try to, maybe you guys can help me remember that, the one about, I can't remember. I'll try to remember it later. But here are some examples of some things that we have used, like chart-wise. This student on the left didn't want to use a character chart, so they just decided to put the name smack in the middle and then started writing out like lines of everything they saw within our readings as we went through the years of Plutarch, of Demosthenes. I have this chart is actually, oh, I should say that. If anyone is in any of my like classes for citizenship or like Plutarch or ancient history, that chart on the right, don't buy it, comes with the class. So if you ever need that, that's there. I just want to say that because Summer did a great job making these, and I know she sells them on her page, but anyone who takes a class gets that for free. So don't buy that. But that was just one we used to help us try to understand this kid used this for Cicero. Of course, it was just starting. He hadn't finished it yet, but it just gives you an idea of ways they can jot down thoughts and ideas as they're working through their reading. They can also do a virtue vice chart. So this kid decided to do vices and virtues as we were doing Plutarch, just jotting down ideas as he was going through the year. Other ways, we use a lot of century charts. Century charts are great for history, ancient history, a biography, world history. They're just great to be able to get a big picture of what's going on. And this one was another Plutarch year of everything that happened in Alexander's life, right? So it's just very helpful for a kid to see the big picture. And a timeline is sometimes helpful. This one was for science, a science textbook. This is an example of a science notebook. This one chose to do vocabulary on a section because science, there's so much information. I think this was a Highcombe book. And this was just notes. You can see drawing, examples of the atom, just bullet point notes. They've color coded it a little bit to help with some different ideas. So those are just some examples. And this is a student who did an outline as they were working through, I think this one was History of American People. They were working through the text. So they decided to do an outline. So that's just a few examples of some things that they can do. So I'm going to stop there and see, does anybody have any questions on any of this?
I do have a question. I know
Yeah.
you said you'd let the students pick, but do you ever feel like you would kind of assign or maybe show them some of these options for
Yes.
narrating?
Yeah, I do. Definitely.
Because you know Chloe, she would pick and do you ever, it would be draw a picture every single time if I never assigned writing. So I feel like, no, you may not draw a picture this time. You must write me something.
Yes, I know for sure. And I mean, they do have to think about it, but when they're drawing that picture, it's kind of like usually it's a scene, right? That's what they're thinking in their mind, which is good, but it doesn't always get everything. So, no, I highly recommend showing examples. That's a good point. I probably need to, I mean, I do this in my class, but I think I will sometime grab some of these examples and put them on my website. So kids can have them to see what does that look like? Like, what do you mean by that, Mom? I think that would be helpful for them to see that. So that's a good idea. Okay. Yeah, I definitely recommend it. And like some books, like in my class, I'm like, okay, we're gonna do this because I know it's the best thing for this book. But we do want them to kind of learn to kind of make choices and figure that out. I know I'm doing that in my literature class next year. You know, I'm not going to be like, you have to do a character chart. I'm going to give them more flexibility of what works because they do need to start making decisions. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Amy, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to wrap what you just said. So you have a reading and there are several stops throughout the reading where they narrate and they're narrating to the wall or to them, whatever works for them.
Yes.
But what you're saying with these charts and diagrams, is that the end of after all of those stops that they're going to do one final written form, or is that what you're saying?
It totally depends on the kid.
Okay.
So I can tell you, all right, for some of these, I don't recommend doing till the end. Like this, I wouldn't do till the end. Some of the charts, maybe. But what I have found is because you don't want to necessarily stop the flow, and I totally get that, especially in a fiction book. But some kids just need to jot down some ideas and thoughts as they're going along. And there is nothing wrong with that because I have to do that. There is no way I could there's a lot I need to process here. And I can't wait until the very end because if I waited till the very end, my narration would be like really bad. And so you got to understand some students are like that. And for us to expect them to remember a whole large amount, it's not really necessarily fair. So it depends. I mean, some kids are like, I do have a few that can totally do the whole thing and narrate just fine. And that's great. But I wouldn't assume that everybody can do that. So I think you're just gonna have to figure out what works best for your kid. Okay. Any other questions? Stacy, is anything in the chat? Because I'm not really seeing that right now. Is it good? Let's see. Okay. Do recaps happen in their mind? Or do they use some narrative? Okay. So it is a mind thing. It is a mind thing. I don't normally, well, I take that back. I have a few times had my students jot down some things because we're in a class setting. I don't want them just to depend on their classmates to bail them out every week. So I will sometimes have my students, because we're in a class setting, write down a few things they remember from last week. Just a quick few minutes. If it's just a student by themselves doing this, then no. I would just be like, make them do it in their mind and just force themselves to do it, if that makes sense. The goal of the narration is to remember correct. I think I might tell my kids to look at the options and try them. Maybe evaluating again which ones are helpful. And yeah. Yeah, I mean, we want them to remember the big ideas, and they might not remember everything, and that is okay. But we don't want them to like be totally clueless the next week when they come back and have nothing. Then it's kind of like wasted. So yeah. How do you keep your student accountable to doing this whole process without the stops? You sit beside, yes. You sit beside them in the beginning. Yep. And you show them the process, and yes, you walk through them. It's just like you would do any other type of habit process, until they get this, until they get the idea. What the growth. Yeah. So our goal is just for them to be able to know how to self-educate. Are they going to do, you want to help them understand the process to move towards being independent learners. Now, are they going to do this as they get older, maybe every time? Probably not. But at least, you know what, you've taught them and they know. And then it is true near the end, you can't be there every second. Are they going to do this like the right way? And are they going to care? And are they do the best effort? Probably not always. And you can't we can't be so about. My whole thing is what I have seen is students really are trying and they just don't know how. And that's what is upsetting to me as a teacher, because I want to make sure they have the tools to do and go far. And that's what I'm doing here. I just feel like a lot of kids, they really want to do well. Now, not all of them. They just want to get by. I mean, there are some of those. I have some of those. But for most part, they do want to know, they want to do well. And I just think we need to make sure we're setting them up for success. Whether they do it every time, that's okay. We're just trying to help build them so they do have the tools and they know how to use them. Okay, I'm going to finish this last part and then we can talk. Any other questions? Okay, so here are my results for this past term and what we learned here. So the results were, these are my students' answers, by the way. When I do my work on my own, do I recall, read, or narrate? And those were the answers. And I asked them to be totally honest because there were no names and they were anonymous. So I told them to be honest. So that's what I got. Are y'all surprised by that? No. Okay. If there were days when you did not do your homework or did not do the correct steps that we have learned, why did you not do them? I forgot. I didn't want to. At least they're honest. I always did my homework on time, but often at the last minute, the day of. And that was because I forgot, because I prioritized other work that was due sooner and I was on vacation. Okay, I didn't pick all of my students' answers. These were just a few. But I just wanted to get you an idea. Okay. All right, for my self-reading, I write a narration either at the end or between my stops, as I have read on my own. So not everybody did some type. Well, actually, nobody did every time.
So for the self-reading, does this mean like it's still the schoolwork? It's just what they're reading independently, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Oh wow. Okay.
This was their independent schoolwork reading. Yes. Okay, this was interesting. I learned better by what? So 70% said they did better by orally narrating. 40% said they wrote some type of narration out that it helped them. 70% participating in a group or class, and I will talk to you guys about that later. There is a reason for that. 70% posting comments in the forum. Okay, my class, I started a forum post this year. Not all my classes do this. I started this in this trial. I was amazed how much that helped my students this year. So they enjoyed reading each other and commenting, and they had to give some type of comment back. And I think that really made them think. So that was really helpful for them. 60% reading on my own and coming to class to discuss. That means I like reading on my own, but I have to be prepared to come to class to be able to talk about it. And that could just be like, I know my son, he does not like to do stuff with me. I want to read it on my own, and then I'll come and discuss it with you, Mom. So a lot of kids can be independent that way. 30% said they liked doing the underlining or highlighting words. And I didn't really talk a lot about that, but some students actually benefit as they're reading to take a pencil, and as they're reading, highlighting main idea, like words, like as they're reading. And I know Dr. Carroll has talked about this and I've used it in the past. I don't use it in my classes because some people find it very distracting. But some kids, that really helps them, and it helps them track. So that could be something you could try with your students. And 50% said using stickies to mark my favorite parts. So those are some things that help them. And then I asked them, and I didn't grab all of them, but I grabbed a few. I told them to tell me what helped them the most in their learning. And I'm trying to find, I can't really see it too well on my screen, so I was going to try to read it on my page here. It says highlighting, underlining. Writing after a few paragraphs is helpful for me to remember what I have read. Oral narration after reading in stickies. Writing, typing short bullet points or main points after each stop and at the end of a reading is helpful. Several actually made that comment. Narrating to someone else helps me, and then also writing after the sections I've read. I do better with orally narrating, and I do better with underlining dates. Doing an oral narration after finishing reading. And then the last one said, I feel like orally narrating out loud is the best form of narration for me. For some reason, I work better narrating to a wall and not to another person. But I can do that as well. Being in a live class instead, because I won't be tempted to drift off into my own thoughts. And I think posting stuff in the forum is a great idea as well. Okay, so what I can say, and she made a very good point. One of my students made a very good point about drifting. And that is a common problem for all of us. And so I think students need to know they are not alone. We all struggle with that, and they need to find out, okay, where did I catch myself drifting? And it's okay to go back. Because if they drifted and they can realize, oh, okay, I want to go back. If they want to, I let them go back. I mean, I can't do it in my class, but if my student at home is reading and it's like, oh, drifted, I'm like, well, go back. Totally fine. It happens to all of us. So, in an online class, it's funny, they are not able to go back. So they have to be on all the time. So I think that's helpful for them to stay on track there. All right. So I just wanted to tell you how well they did on exam day. And I can say I am a harsh grader. And anyone who knows and has had students in my classes, they will vouch for that. Why did my child get a 4? I could just hear their thoughts. But I can tell you, I had a 98% in that class for that term, because that did the steps and did all the things with me for that. So these steps really do work, and it really, really helps, I think, boost their I can do this on my own kind of thing. So hopefully that was helpful.